All right, so when we've talked about poetry in this class, most of it's been narrative poetry, right? Most of it's been poetry that, at least on some level, tells a story, right? We looked at Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, the Bhagavad Gita, right? It's almost all narrative, right? Probably the one exception would be the Tao Te Ching, which is a set of short lyric poems related to a particular philosophy, right? Now, this is actually a lot more closely related to concepts in the Tao Te Ching than might first appear. But I guess I just want to gauge from, like, what did you think of these poems?
I like them.
Okay, what'd you like about them, Daishan?
Well, I liked how each of them told like a mini story, and it didn't necessarily have to be like long and drawn out, but like, for example, like the one about the war, it told it like really short and compactly, and I thought it sounded pretty. And then the one where he was like drinking along with the moon, it was short, but it was still nice, like it's still.
Okay, yeah, so what we get usually instead of a story with a beginning, a middle, and end, right, is the presentation of a situation, right? We get a detailed presentation of a single short situation, which might be part of a longer story and might not be, in which the speaker sort of gives us some sense of his surroundings and what he's feeling and thinking about, right? Other impressions you guys had of these poems? Anything else?
Drink.
What's that?
Likes to drink.
Okay, yeah, there are lots of references to wine, right? And let's talk a little bit about what's going on with the wine here, because it's a little bit more complicated than it might look. Most of the images in Li Bo's poems are conventional, right? Most of the things that he talks about had a particular symbolic resonance in Chinese poetry generally. Wine is one of those things. Wine is a conventional image in Chinese poetry. Now, Li Bo probably uses it a little bit more than most, but to his readers, it would have had a particular set of meanings, a particular set of associations. The first being that wine is used as a representation for social life. Right? Wine is something that is supposed to be shared with friends and relatives, right? So usually if you see discussion of wine in a Chinese poem, it is in the context of a social gathering, right? Of forming bonds over the wine goblet. It was also a luxury item. Right? Wine was expensive. So, the drinking of wine often connotes a special occasion, or that the subject of the poem has a great deal of wealth that he or she can afford to just blow on booze. The third thing that it often represents in Chinese poetry is poetic inspiration. Now, there are two poems in particular here where these three meanings come together. The more conventional is Bring in the Wine on page 1025. So can I get a volunteer to start reading this? Yeah, Ashlyn, go for it.
Look there, the waters of the Yellow River, coming down from heaven, rush in their flow to the sea, never turn back again. Look there, bright in the mirrors and lighting halls, a grieving for white hair, this morning blue black strands of silk, now turns to snow with evening.
Okay, you can stop there. I just want to sort of unpack these two images here, right? So the river that's mentioned in the first little 5-line unit here, after the first look there, the river is also a conventional image. What do we notice about the way he describes the river here? What does it do? What is its action like?
It comes down from heaven and flows to the sea.
Flows to the sea. Does it flow in more than one direction?
No.
Nope. Always flows the same way. Always flows the same direction. There's no going back. There's no returning. So the river is often symbolically associated with time. It also represents, particularly in Daoist imagery, a kind of slow, irresistible force. Right, you may remember from the Tao Te Ching the image of the river slowly wearing away the face of the rock, right? Right. Constant pressure applied to passive objects. So when we pair that then with the second little line unit that Ashlyn read for us, right? Bright in the mirrors of mighty halls, a grieving for white hair, this morning blue-black strands of silk now turn to snow with evening. What's he talking about here? Yeah, aging, getting older, right? You only get older, you never get younger. That's a depressing thought for a Monday morning, right? Time only flows in one direction, like the river. All right, so can I get somebody to start reading from For Satisfaction in This Life? Yeah, Tessa, go for it.
For satisfaction in this life, taste pleasure to live it, and never get a goblet of gold. Face the bright moon empty. Heaven bred in me talents, and they must be put to use. I toss away 1,000 in gold, it comes right back to me. So boil a sheep, butcher an ox, make merry for a while. And when you sit yourself to drink, always down to 300 cups. Hey, Master Ken, ho, thank you. Bring the wine. Keep the cups coming.
Okay, you can stop there, right? All right, so what conventional association with wine are we getting in this little passage here? What's he talking about here? What sort of scene does he seem to be describing?
Party.
Yeah, it's a party. It's a social gathering, and apparently a big one, right? In which everybody ought to be downing 300 cups of wine. And the extravagance, right, is worth it, right? I throw away 1,000 in gold to buy all the wine for the party, but because the wine helps me bond with these other people, it comes back to me, it's worth it, right? And I'll sing you a song. Somebody to read from there. All right, Daisha, go for it.
And I'll sing you a song. You bend me your ears and listen. The bells and the drums, the tastiest morsels. It's not these that I love. All I want is to stay dead drunk and never sober up. The sages and worthies of ancient days now lie silent forever, and only the greatest drinkers have a fame that lingers on. Once long ago, the Prince of Chin held a party at Pingle Lodge. A gallon of wine cost 10,000 cash. All the joy and laughter they pleased. So you, my host, how can you tell me you're short on cash? Go right out. Buy us some wine, and I'll do the pouring for you. Then take my dapper horse, take my furs worth a fortune. Just call the boy to get them and trade them for lovely wine. And here together we'll melt the sorrows of all eternity.
Okay, so to not purchase wine for your party, right, is stinginess, right? To worry about the gold, to worry about the cost, is to care more about hoarding earthly pleasures, hoarding earthly objects, than it is to promote pleasure among your friends, right? So Li Bo seems to see that as a bad thing, right? Why hoard all this money just for yourself when you can use it to make a whole bunch of people happy? Right? He even sort of cites historical precedent. This is a fairly common device in Chinese literature as well. When he talks about the Prince of Chen holding a party at Pingle Lodge, there are frequent allusions to history and folklore, to specific moments in history and folklore that won't be explained to you, but that are meant to be symbolic. Yeah. Poetry in China in this period is highly, highly elusive, which is why it's a good thing we have footnotes. So the wine here also serves for Li Bo as artistic inspiration, right? Keep the cups coming and I'll sing you a song. Right? He wants to stay dead drunk. Now, does he want to stay dead drunk necessarily because he's a sick alcoholic?
No, he needs it for inspiration.
Yeah. The wine gives him inspiration. The wine keeps the poetry coming, and it keeps him in the company of his friends, right? Yeah, Larry.
So is this like in reference to the whole aging and stuff? It's like live life to the fullest, like Carpe Diem?
Exactly. Yeah, what we have here is a Chinese example of what in the West we'd call a Carpe Diem poem, a seize the day poem, right? You're not going to get any younger, right? Life is already slipping away from you. So why not spend what time you have in good company, drinking good wine, eating good food, and composing lines that very well may make you immortal. The idea of immortality actually is also a big thing in Li Bo's poetry. We'll get to that in a little while. So this is a poem in which Li Bo is using the wine image in pretty much all of the ways it's conventionally intended in Chinese poetry. Now, if we move on to Drinking Alone with the Moon on the next page, on page 1026, this is a little different. Can I get a volunteer to read this? All right, Jamal, go for it.
A pot of wine among the flowers, I drink alone, no friend with me. I raise my cup to invite the moon, he and my shadow and I make three. The moon does not know how to drink, my shadow's mine, my capering. But I'll make merry with them both, and soon enough it will be spring. I sing, the moon moves to and fro. I dance, my shadow leaps and sways. Still sober, we exchange our joys. Drunk, and we'll go our separate ways. Let's pledge, beyond human ties, to be friends, and meet where the silver river ends.
Okay, so what's different in this poem?
He's not drinking for inspiration or for lecture or such, but he's just drinking by himself.
Yeah, he's drinking alone. That's not, what's that? It is, yeah. Yeah, now, what does he do then to make it so that he's not drinking alone?
Invite the moon in his shadow.
Yeah, the moon in the shadow, right? Now, the moon is also a sort of conventional time symbol, in particular associated with seasonal cycles. Right, the waxing and waning of the moon over the course of a month. But what do we notice about the way the speaker in the poem interacts with the moon and the shadow here? What's the first thing he says about the moon in the second stanza?
Doesn't matter.
The moon does not know how to drink, right? The moon thus does not know how to be companionable. The moon doesn't know how to have a good time, how to be at a party. And what about the shadow? What does the shadow do throughout? Yeah, all the shadow does is copy what he does. Right? The shadow mimes my capering, right? I sing, the moon moves to and fro. I dance, my shadow leaps and sways. Does any object in the poem move in a way that is not simply in relation to the speaker? Yeah, everything moves in relation to him. So these companions that he's supposed to have in his, in his little lonely drinking party are in a way kind of just reminders of how alone he is. Right? The shadow and the moon don't move at all unless he does. Right? He's a fixed point that everything else here revolves around. Now, it's also worth mentioning that he notes here the coming of spring. Now, when we think of the season of spring, what does that usually conjure up for us? What do we usually think of? Okay, yeah, we think of rebirth, flowers, fertility, right? The earth renewed after the winter, yeah? Beautiful flowers springing up from the ground. That is not the conventional Chinese association with spring. Spring is a season of ephemeral beauty, right? Beauty that is temporary, that is going to fade, that leads to regret for loss. Right? Spring is the season of regret. Yeah, Corey.
Well, in Japan, over there, isn't it just a winter in spring? Because isn't it the opposite?
Well, it's not quite. That's a northern southern hemisphere thing. Like Australia, for example, has its spring when we have our fall, right? Most of China is north of the equator. So it's not so much the issue of different seasons at different times of the year. They would still have the same seasons, just at a different time. But yeah, the whole point of spring, the whole idea of spring is that you've got all this beauty around you that is only going to last for a few weeks and then is going to die. So yeah, spring is a reminder of the fragility of beautiful things in the world. Spring is a reminder of mortality. And soon enough it will be spring. I sing, the moon moves to and fro, I dance, my shadow leaps and sways. Still sober we exchange our joys, drunk, and we'll go our separate ways. Let's pledge, beyond human ties, to be friends, and meet where the silver river ends. So here we have that river image again, right? That image of time persistently pushing you forward. That image of something that you can't, things you can't get back. Things you can't simply reverse. So all of this inexorably pushes in the direction of death, right? Of your final end. There is a fixation on mortality in Li Bo's poetry. And in some of these poems, a fixation on trying to transcend the limits of mortality. But we'll pick that up in a minute. We'll deal with that. Were there other poems or other images that really spoke to you? I just wanted to try to tease out the importance of the wine image here for you, so that you knew what was going on with it. Anything else that really struck you in these poems? Yeah, Barry.
It varies locations a lot and has, like, you have the party and the battle, which is very reality based, and you have a lot of them that are really fantasy based, like him climbing up the mountain. That final long poem about ascending Heaven's Crown Mountain is very much caught up in Daoist symbolism. And in sort of certain concepts of Chinese alchemy and folk religion. But yeah, the reason why it varies locations so much and varies situations so much, poetry was a really, really big part of the life of the educated person in China in this particular historical period, right? So Li Bo is writing at the peak of, it's called the Tang Dynasty. And the Tang ruled China from about 618 to 907. So for a period of almost 300 years. And they came to power after a long period of instability. Right, and sort of reunited what had been three separate kingdoms. And one of the things that they did was set up a widespread and efficient civil service. And in order to, the civil service was the main means of social advancements. Right? If you could get one of these government posts, you had it made, right? So people educated their children to take a series of exacting exams that covered topics like philosophy, music, history, and poetry. Candidates for the exam were required to write poetry and have it judged by the examiners. So what we have here is sort of, in the East, developing around the same time as it was in the West, kind of a liberal arts curriculum, right? The idea that a well-rounded gentleman should possess all of these particular attributes. Now, are we recognizing the values of any particular belief system in all of this? Yeah, this all sounds very Confucian, right? The idea of education as a kind of cultivating force, right? That human beings need structured hierarchies, and that we need to sort of shape ourselves to fulfill our proper roles in these complex social organizations, right? So that's what these exams are designed to do. And writing poetry was part of the examination. Right? If you passed the examination, you got a little certificate, and that was your ticket then to a good civil service job. Now, in theory, people of any social standing could take these exams. In practice, people who were already rich tended to do a little better, largely because they could afford expensive tutoring. But these civil servants, when they went out to their various posts, then used poetry as a form of communication. Right. It was sort of a systematic language, a sort of alternate language in which they were all fluent. And so there were particular situations in which you were expected to write a poem. Right, when you were socially expected to write a poem. If you, for example, visited an interesting or important place, you write a poem about it that demonstrates to your peers your attention to beauty and to detail. If you are going off to a post in a distant city, or your friend is doing likewise, you write a poem of leave-taking to say goodbye to that person and give it to them as a gift. Right? If you experience some sort of important life event, you write a poem about it that demonstrates that you understand its significance for yourself, your family, and your wider social group. Right? So, in a way, what this Tang Dynasty poetry was doing was a form of social signaling. Right? It was your way of showing how well you understood and how well you were able to work within the values of the culture at large. Now, Li Bo never took the civil service examination. And he never held a permanent civil service post. And we often see in his poems a kind of playing with or inversion of some of these usual tropes. Inspired in part by religious countercurrents running through Tang Dynasty China, right? So we've already noted, right, this whole civil service structure looks very Confucian, right? That the whole idea of this seems deeply Confucian. But during the Tang Dynasty, Confucianism waned in influence in favor of one native religious system, Taoism, and one imported religious belief system, Buddhism. Right, this is around the period that Buddhism becomes particularly important in China. Now, Buddhism came by way primarily of traveling merchants, right? The Tang Dynasty is sort of the point at which China achieved its peak of wealth, its early peak of wealth anyway. And it did so because there were a number of large cosmopolitan cities that became big trading centers. And so merchants from India were coming up, they were trading in cities like the Tang capital, Chang'an, which is now called Xi'an. In fact, we just had a student who had done a year in Xi'an come back and give a presentation on it. And you know, they brought with them, you know, not just goods to trade, but also ideas and writings. And as these Buddhist ideas start to filter into Chinese culture, they change a lot of features of the culture, right? Now, does Confucianism, at least given the understanding that you got from this class, does Confucianism transcend the worldly in any way? Is there any kind of salvation in Confucianism? What's the ultimate good in Confucianism? Becoming a perfect gentleman, right? And you do that by cultivating your intellectual faculties, by practicing the rituals, right? And by performing them to the best of your ability, right? It's all about your social life. It's all about coordinating your position in society. Buddhism, on the other hand, rejects the worldly in favor of the otherworldly. All right, so in order to become a Buddhist monk, does anybody know what you have to do to become a Buddhist monk? Yeah, you have to shave your head. That's one thing, right? Yep, cut off all your social ties.
Anything that binds you earthly, like
Yep.
belongings.
Yep, you give away all your possessions.
You live off the charity of others.
Live off the charity of others.
Meditate for hours.
Pardon?
Meditate for hours.
Meditate for hours.
You don't eat meat.
I think that's mostly correct. Yeah, you're, at the very least, you're supposed to eat only very simple meals.
Just want to reach enlightenment. That's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, and so you give up your hair, your possessions, your name, right? Most people, upon becoming Buddhist monks, they give up, they give up the name they were given by their parents. They give up. It's symbolic of renouncing all family ties and all social ties. Now, if you're looking at this from the point of view of a Confucian, right, this looks really weird and potentially dangerous. Right? You're giving up your responsibilities to family and to society in exchange for personal salvation. Right? So there's a lot of tension between these particular viewpoints. Now, Taoism, on the other hand, Taoism is much more compatible in a lot of ways with Buddhism than Confucianism is. Right? Taoism emphasizes the cultivation of personal power through inaction, right? You cultivate your potential for action by holding it back. Now, in the Tang period, this led to a lot of unusual practices. In particular, the consumption of longevity potions. Right? Now, we talked a little bit about this when we talked about Marco Polo's travels, right? That he was talking about these Brahmins, and he said they were drinking mixtures made of sulfur and mercury. Now, Indian Brahmins did not do that. But Chinese Daoist alchemists did. Right? So that's just a point that Polo was a little bit confused about. And they did this with full knowledge that mercury is poisonous, right? That mercury is not something you are supposed to consume if you want to live a long time, right? It seems sort of antithetical to the idea of a longevity potion, right? That, oh, hey, I'm going to drink something that I know is completely toxic. But the idea was to try to kill the earthly body to stop it from holding back the spiritual body, right? So when he talks about these immortals, for example, that he sees on top of the mountain, on page 1029, right? Thunder rumbling and lightning cracks. Hill ridges split and fell. Then the stone doors of caves to heaven swung open with a crash. A billowing vast blue blackness whose bottom could not be seen, where sun and moon were gleaming on terraces silver and gold. Their coats were of rainbow. Winds were their steeds. The lords of the clouds came down in their hosts. Tigers struck harps. Phoenixes drew coaches in circles. Those who were the undying stood in ranks like hemp. All at once my soul was struck, and my spirit shuddered. I leapt up in dazed alarm, and gave a long sigh. I was aware only of this moment's pillow and mat. I had lost those mists and bright wisps that had been here just before. So he's given a vision here, a kind of dream vision, of people who have managed to transcend their earthly bodies. People who are referred to as Taoist immortals. They no longer have or need physical bodies, right? They're beings of pure spiritual power now. The flesh that held them back is gone. I think let's turn back here to 1024. To south of the walls we fought, where I think we also see an expression by the end of the poem anyway of important Taoist ideas. Can I get a volunteer to read this? Yeah, Larry, go for it.
We fought last year at Sangin's source. This year we fight on the Kong River Road. We wash weapons in the surf of Tiaozi. Graze horses on grass and sky mountain snow. Thousands of miles ever marching and fighting, until all the grand army grows frail and old. These young new treat slaughtered at Farmer's Creek plowing. Since bygone days, only white bones are seen in their fields of yellow sand. The house of Keon built the wall to guard against the Turk. For the house of Han, the beacon fires were blazing still. Beacon fires blazed without ceasing. The marching and battle never ended. They died in fighting on the steeps. Their vanquished horses neigh, mourning to the sky. Kites and ravens peck men's guts, fly with them dangling from their beaks, and hang them high on boughs of barren trees. The troops lie in mud-smearing grasses, and the general acted all in vain. Now I truly see that weapons are evil's tool. The sage will use them only when he cannot do otherwise.
Okay, so the reference to the sage sounds familiar, right? That's all over the Tao Te Ching, right? Every other verse is the sage does this, the sage does that, right? Or more appropriately, usually, the sage does not do this. And what in this case does the sage not do?
Use weapons.
Use weapons. Yeah, the sage does not make war. Why not? What's the picture we get of war from this? Yeah, go ahead, Ashley.
We get a picture that war is violent and gruesome and worthless. It's not worth it. And it goes against the Taoist idea of inaction.
Yeah, war is action, right? War is most assuredly action. And who is the active force here? Who is taking this action as described, particularly in the last stanza? Yeah, the general acted all in vain, right? And when the general acts, what happens to the soldiers? The soldiers are the ones who suffer, right? The soldiers die. So the actions of a bad leader end up harming the people he leads. Right, we fought last year at the Sang'an source. This year we fight on the Kong River Road. We washed weapons in the surf of Tiaozi, grazed horses on grass in Sky Mountain snow, thousands of miles ever marching and fighting until all the grand army grows frail and old. Do we see one of these conventional images we were talking about in this first stanza? Yeah, a lot of references here to rivers, right? So why is the marching of the army here like a river? It's a constant flow, one direction, right? And at the end of it, they're all frail and old. Exactly, yeah. Over time, this mighty army gets old, gets weak, right? The Xiongnu treat slaughter as farmers treat plowing. Since bygone days, only white bones are seen in their fields of yellow sand. The house of Qin built the wall to guard against the Turk. For the house of Han, the beacon fires are blazing still. Now, the Qin and the Han are earlier Chinese dynasties. The Qin dynasty is regarded as like the first modern Chinese dynasty. They're the ones who actually give the country its name. Right. China, if you actually translate it into Chinese, it means land of the Qin. And the Qin built a certain well-known defensive structure along the northern border of the country.
The Great Wall.
Yeah, exactly. They're the builders of the Great Wall. To keep the Mongol horsemen to the north out of the country. The Han were the last real dynasty before the Tang. And they're associated here with beacon fires. So these older dynasties are they associated with aggressive warlike measures here in the poem? What are they doing instead?
Like preventive measures.
Yeah, preventive, defensive, right? Yeah, these older dynasties are associated solely with defense of the country, not with aggressive war making, right? Not with conquest or with invasion. Beacon fires blaze without ceasing. The marching and battle never end. They died in fighting on the steppes. Their vanquished horses neigh, warning to the sky. Kites and ravens peck men's guts, fly with them dangling from their beaks, and hang them high on boughs of barren trees. The troops lie mud-smeared in grasses, and the general acted all in vain. So the inevitable results of this ever-moving river of humanity, right, is the kind of mass slaughter that Lipo describes in the final stanza here, right? This is what that river pushes an army towards. Right? An army on the march only ends badly. Now we get a more personal attitude towards the river image. If we look on the hardships of traveling the road I on page 1027. Can I get a volunteer to read this? Starting with clear wine and golden goblets. Yeah, go ahead.
Clear wine and golden goblets at 10,000 a peck. Prized delicacies on jade plates worth a myriad of cash. But I stopped the cup, threw down the chopsticks, was unable to eat. I took out my sword, stared all around, my heart was blindly lost. I wanted to cross the yellow river, but ice blocked the waterway. Was about to climb the T'ang range, but snow darkened the sky. At my ease, I let fall a line, sitting by the side of a stream, longed to be aboard ship again and dreamt of the realm of the sun. The hardships of traveling the road, to many branching roads, and where now am I? The long wind will smite the waves, and surely will come a time to hang straight the cloudy sail and cross the great blue sea.
So, is there anything, particularly in the first part of this poem, that seems particularly unlike the image of Libo that he seems to present in other poems?
Rejecting luxury.
Yeah, he's rejecting all of the earthly pleasures, right? He won't eat, he won't drink, he gets no enjoyment from the luxuries around him. Right, I took out my sword, stared all around, my heart was blindly lost. I wanted to cross the Yellow River, but ice blocked the waterway, was about to climb the T'ang range, but snow darkened the sky. At my ease I let fall a line, sitting by the side of a stream, longed to be aboard ship again, and dreamt of the realm of the sun. Now, what's the difference between traveling the road versus traveling a river? Try to think of this from a Daoist perspective.
Well, the road is paved and you know where you're gonna go.
The road's paved if you're lucky.
Or, well, you know where you're gonna go. It leads somewhere. But the river, you don't know where.
The only way to move down a road is for you to take action.
Yes.
On a river, you can just let the river take you where else.
Exactly, yes. Traveling a road.
Unless the road's on a hill, you just kind of...
Well, but yeah, but then you still probably have to go up one side of the hill and then down the other, right? So it can never be entirely passive. But yeah, what we have here is there's a preference for a passive means of carrying you along over an active means of, choosing your own path, right? He talks about the many branching roads, right? Okay, I have to decide which one I'm going to walk. Not only that, but as I walk, there are all these difficulties in my way. There's ice blocking my path, right? There's a mountain I can't climb over. There's all this stuff getting in my way. If I'm just floating down the river, if I'm just accepting things as they are and passively letting the current carry me along, I don't have to worry about any of that shit. Right? I can just be. I can just flow. We get a similar idea in the poem Athens. We have one of those conventional leave-taking poems here, right? Written for a friend that he was going to